very, very warm welcome to all. Look at all your smiley faces all sat there, wherever you are, wherever you are in the world. Really happy to have this opportunity to speak with you today. Fantastic. So very, very warm welcome to you. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me to share all of this content today, and thank you all for coming along. It's a real pleasure to be asked to share with you a topic I'm absolutely passionate about, and I think is a really vital knowledge and skill base to have alive in your toolkits and your awareness, particularly at this time. So whilst trauma could be seen as a really heavy topic, understanding it really demystifies it, and understanding the roots of it and the causes of it. And as supporters of those who have it, there's so much you can do to prevent its effects from impacting on well-being, on learning, and potentially actually improve outcomes for young people, for children, for colleagues, for parents, and even yourself. And so with a few simple understandings and a few simple principles, we can go a long way to improving the support of trauma. The even better news, I think, with this is that with these understandings, I think you'll see that there are ways in which all of the ways that you already work, and perhaps with a few tweaks here and there, in some cases, be open and aware of that, can really encourage the managing of learning environments and the managing of, and support of positive behaviours and building self-esteem in a way that's so aligned with trauma work. So I'm certain that what you learn today is going to be very useful outside of the work context as much as it might be within the work context, with family, with friends, with communities that you support. So it is a short introduction to trauma, and its primary purpose today is to raise awareness of trauma and the likely incidence of it, to look at that partly in the context of the pandemic that we're currently experiencing. So what you can do to recognise trauma, supporting those with it, flagging up some of the tools and techniques that you can use with it, and working both with individuals, but also what you can do in groups, small groups and so forth, that can also be helpful. So I must add, this is a massive subject, and there's been some fantastic research in recent years into new approaches to dealing with trauma. But in the 45 or so minutes I've got today, we'll only scratch the surface. But in some ways, I suppose I was saying to Anne yesterday, a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. And so we need to be clear that this program is not designed today to train you as a psychotherapist in 45 minutes, although some of you may already be. But it is designed to give you some really clear pointers so that you can help, but also do no harm as well. So you may also recognise in what we're sharing today, as you listen, some elements of trauma in yourself. And most adults have some pieces of trauma, either from early or more recent lives, and those vary in degree. So the same principles we look at here can also really help with your own self-support and self-coaching. So let's have a look at what's going to be in the programme. So in this afternoon session, why be interested in psychological trauma, and what is psychological trauma? So we'll get to define it and see how you can recognise it. So what are the signs that it's going on in a person? And then how can we respond to it in ways that are supportive and are safe? So you saw me briefly in sort of relaxed in my back bedroom kind of mode. This is me sort of looking a bit more professional, although actually I look more like that at the moment most of the time, as we all do as we go about our business. And this is me looking very excited. That was just going to see some young people get their Duke of Edinburgh's Awards a couple of years ago at St James's Palace. Just wanted to warn you that I did get excited about this topic, and I hope that's not inappropriate, because the excitement comes from, whilst trauma is a terrible thing, the excitement comes from a place of we can really do something to help. we can really change our practices and spread the word about some simple things that help when we come across people who are experiencing it. I want to thank you. I know it's a very wide audience group of people here today, and many of you will be connected with education, and obviously through the Steve Sinnott Foundation. That is, you know, one of the strong links that SSF has. And a few weeks ago, in kind of midst of lockdown, I was in the park in my hometown, and I overheard a conversation that went something like this. And I'll just let you read it. I do apologise. There are a few expletives. There's a little bit of swearing and Anglo-Saxon in there, but I've bleated it out. I'll just give you a chance to read that. And so for those of you that are in education, you know, over the last few months, it's been bumpy, and it's been bumpy for all of us, whatever your role, whether you're a parent, whether you're a person who's been working through this on your own, whether you're a teacher or in other roles. And it's we've in the UK we've clapped for the NHS and many others, but I think often teachers and support staff in schools haven't got as much of a mention. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of those who are here today, who are involved with education, for all that you've done over these past few months. And you know, to say an enormous thank you for all that you've done to steady yourself and manage your own pressures at home, among your families, friends, and transition in and out of school, and still keep giving to children and your co-workers at school the service that you have. My background is former science teacher and school senior leader in schools, and in 2002 I left to take up a freelance career in training, professional coaching and therapy. And so I come to this topic with a master's degree in counselling and guidance, a number of therapeutic qualifications in hypnotherapy, counselling, coaching and trauma-informed practice. And I currently work in private practice and do work for schools, charities and other organisations, supporting them with therapeutic interventions, but also with leadership support and development. And I've worked with SSF now for a long time. I can't actually remember. I was trying to remember how long it was, but it's been a hell of a privilege to work with some incredible projects with SSF over the last few years in Nepal, Sierra Leone and the UK. So this topic of trauma comes up time and again. And I've recently begun doctoral research looking at PTSD, and that kind of relates to this topic too. So let's get into the process for today. I just wondered if you'd give yourself a few moments just to pause and reflect. If you think back over the past few months to all the ways you feel good about what you've overcome, the problems you've solved, the difficulties you've dealt with, I wonder if you can notice some of the things that, as you think back over the last few months, bring you good feelings, positive thoughts. I'm just going to give you a moment just to check in with yourself there. And you can notice where those are located in your body, where you actually feel those positive feelings, where you feel what we call the felt sense of those positives. And I'm wondering if you might even be able to add some labels to the strengths and the attitudes you've brought to the last 5 to 6 months. I ask that of you because that gives you an insight into some of the ways that we can work with trauma. And as we go through this program, this next 40 minutes or so, being aware of what we call this felt sense within the body, these feelings of the successes we have, the attitudes that we can connect with, is a useful part of working with not just trauma, but with others with trauma. So why be interested in psychological or emotional trauma? So trauma is it's a neurological state which we now understand a great deal about, both in terms of the psychological aspect of it, so how it makes us think, but also the physiological aspect of it, what it does to both our brains and our bodies on a physiological level. And it's actually a natural survival state. Hypersensitizing as makes us really vigilant, hypervigilant to threats to our survival. So in a sense, we all can have bits of low-level trauma if we've not dealt with something from the small or the bigger experiences in our lives. And that when a threshold is triggered in our nervous system as the result of life events, this is what gives us trauma. But why should we be bothered by this? Might sound like an obvious question. But trauma is a semi-permanent state where our neurology, our nervous system, goes into overload. And this causes immediate effects on our ability to learn and to engage with other people. It also causes longer-term effects on mental and physical health. And a child in a traumatized state is not a learning child. So this is equally true for adults in our schools and workplaces as well. We can have a really positive direct effect on the outcomes for learners in classrooms and those around us if we know more about trauma. So children who experience what we've come to call adverse childhood events, so for example abuse, neglect, some divorce, some bereavement, ill health of themselves or family members, or unsupported high expectations, sudden changes in circumstances, they can all be at higher risk of trauma. That doesn't mean they will develop it. So when that trauma does occur and it's not treated, there is a much higher risk. So research is showing us now that there's a much higher risk later in life of comorbidity factors, substance abuse and risky behaviour patterns. And so complex sort of mental, physical health problems can evolve in later life. But anyone can experience that, and trauma can lead to poor mental and poor physical health outcomes over time. So studies have shown, variously shown, a reduced lifespan as well from trauma experiences based on those experiencing these ACEs. So that doesn't sound very chirpy, and I'm sorry about that. But what's to come next, I think, as we look at some of the research that's been done in recent months, starts to give us a lot of hope about how we can support the change in this, not just through trauma events that have happened through the recent pandemic, but also that link back in time before that. So one study that's attempted to quantify what's happening with trauma shows that the degree of trauma-specific symptoms that have increased in the pandemic have gone up by between 4% and 41%. That's a huge range. And that depends on circumstances, that depends on location, it depends on a lot of factors. But this the pandemic is not the only factor that creates trauma potentially. And so the Mental Health Foundation, led by a joint team of four UK universities, is showing that anxiety and panic have increased during the last 6 months. but interestingly, they've also decreased. So what I mean by that is that back in March, they found that it was a sample size of about 4,000 people, that people in the sample size showing significant anxiety was right up at 62%. But by May, this had dropped significantly to 53%, and the expectation is this will have dropped again. And particular groups within this study population seemed at greater risk of this, a higher risk of these heightened anxieties. And those were students aged 16 plus and women aged up to 35. So those are notable groups, I think, for us to pay attention to. It's interesting that feelings of panic and panic attacks in this study dropped back from 22% in the sample group in March to 13%. So whilst, as we'd expect, the stresses of the last few months have taken their toll, I think it's quite interesting to look at research like that and to reflect on how some of what we're experiencing may be part of a natural adaptation curve. Up on the screen there is Elizabeth Ross's grief or change cycle. And it shows some of the stages that we might go through when we're adapting to change. So we might initially have some kind of shock or denial kind of phases. We might then go through emoting, where we have lots of complex emotions. We might then withdraw, go into ourselves, withdraw back from the world and from relationships. We then start to perhaps adapt and accept the situation we're in, and also to adapt in ways that are new. So they're not just trying to work with old patterns and approaches, but developing new ways of working. And you might recognize some of this in the people around you, or even yourself. I mean, the Kubler-Ross cycle is not meant to be a linear or simple process, and it might be experienced in a different order and with different layers of that coming forward. But I think it's quite helpful in the context of all the bad news that we've been hearing over the last few months to recognise that there is evidence that we are going through a natural cycle of adaptation through this process. So let's move into kind of really focusing in on trauma and what psychological trauma is and how you can recognise it. So how would you recognise it in that 4 to 41% of people that are showing signs of having gone through a process of being overwhelmed? So trauma is a natural survival response. So it's a natural response to what's happening around us. And that pushes us over a threshold mentally, and it pushes us into overwhelm. So in trauma, we're not only pushed over that threshold, but our nervous system stays upcycled, hyper alert, stays in a state of too much arousal. And it's designed to help us survive and avoid danger. But in a modern world, that's a bit misguided, and it can be extreme and can really interfere with our well-being and our learning. And partly this is to do with the brain being flooded by cortisol and adrenaline. So trauma stops people from adapting, and it stops them moving through that change cycle that I've just shown you. It stops them potentially from learning, and it's really a wiring for escape and avoidance, or actually to stand up and fight, to defend. It's a brain and body response, and it's the whole of your system rallying for survival. So in trauma, we're not only pushed over that threshold, but we stay there. So different researchers into trauma give different physiological explanations. So one explanation is to look at the amygdala, a part of the brain that deals with our fear-based responses, our fight or flight. And this part of the brain is quite primitive, and it decides what goes to our limbic system, which is the emotional part of the brain, what goes up to the cerebral cortex, which is the part of the brain that deals with a kind of higher order thinking. And it also is it also works on then survival emergency type behaviors, our kind of fight or flight responses. So when trauma occurs, and this is where we get into a definition of trauma, the person concerned receives a stimulus which is either too much for too long, it's happening too soon, so we don't have the resources, or it's happening too fast. We're feeling that it's coming at us too quickly. So a child, for example, who's experiencing domestic abuse could go into trauma over one incident that was too much, too quickly, too soon. Or it could happen over a much longer term. So the threat of that happening, or something, violent experiences happening regularly, could also push them into trauma. And the isolation of lockdown for some people could trigger trauma in an adult over, say, one weekend, or the combination of that feeling of isolation and the news of, say, I don't know, a hospitalized relative could trigger that snap into overwhelm and a trauma state. So if we don't feel that we've got the inner resources to deal with that situation, trauma is, in essence, it's the hypervigilance that is left after that overwhelming experience. And if your mind or body is tipped over that threshold of too much, too soon, for too long, or too fast, etc., you'll experience possibly two types of response to that, two types of reaction. So you might get raw trauma responses, and those are feelings of overwhelm, panic, anxiety, fear, anger, maybe even panic attacks. And these might be intermittent or regular, and they tend to be seen more in younger people than adults, although that does vary. Eventually, what happens is we move into what are called adaptive responses to those kinds of overwhelms. And this is where you might mask or work with your trauma with a series of stress responses. And I'll come on to these in a moment in a bit more detail. But these are behaviors like placating, what we might call people pleasing, or blaming and criticizing, and so on. So we have those two types of response. One is a very raw, visceral kind of response, and the other is a more managed response by the nervous system, by the brain. But once we've been pushed over this threshold and the amygdala trips into this hyper arousal, it'll either stay on pretty much permanently, or it'll be on a hair trigger. And so what we see typically with people in trauma is very small triggers will cause that anxiety and fight or flight response to happen. But also that might build up over time. And they may be running a kind of free-floating anxious feeling for over a long period of time. So it might be in the background. So they're just to sort of illustrate the different parts of the brain. This is the amygdala that I mentioned earlier. This is the part of the brain that receives all that data from external sensory resources, sensory receptors in the eyes and the ears and about the surroundings. And this is the part of the brain that makes a, albeit unconscious, decision as to whether this has reached some sort of threshold, this experience, and needs an anxiety, fear kind of response or not. So these adaptive responses, as well as perhaps seeing or noticing signs of people having the raw trauma experiences, the anxiety, which often will show itself in their breathing rate, in the way that they're behaving and responding in a situation, to reddening or colouring of the skin, to kind of the way that they're interacting with people around them. Very often what we see are behaviours in this list here. So we might see someone trying really hard to please other people, putting other people's needs ahead of their own. We might also find blaming and criticising behaviour, where things going on around them, systems around them might be criticised. That blaming might actually extend to other people, and complaining and blaming other people. And often it won't appear to be appropriate for the situation. Hyper-rationalising, which is where we fill our mind with thoughts and problem solving, and we're blocking out, in that state, we're blocking out emotions, our own emotions, but also the kind of connecting with other people and the empathy that we have for other people. So that tends to be a kind of almost operating a little bit like a computer. And then the avoiding behavior, which the avoiding responses, where that's at a low level, it's blocking out and avoiding any relationship with feelings, with the situation that we're in. So it might at a low level be kind of watching TV that is a little bit mindless, and it allows you to disengage, through to more extreme forms of avoiding, like substance use, substance misuse, gambling, and so on. And then controlling behaviour, which is also something that you might see, attempting to control circumstances and situations around the person, or actually trying to manipulate other people into situations where that person gets more of what they need. So those are some of the things, and as you can see, it's quite broad, and it's something that you probably could say, actually, I can see some of that in myself sometimes. And that's because these are all at a level normal behaviours. It's just that if we are triggered into overwhelm and have trauma, we might see more of these behaviours as a way of coping with the fear and the anxiety that comes up. This is a completely individual experience. I've worked with people in armed forces, in situations where they've been in abusive relationships, have had crimes perpetrated against them. And what's so interesting about this is, and unfathomable in a way, is the way that one person in one set of circumstances will have really intense, life-changing trauma. They might have, full PTSD symptoms, flashbacks, night terrors, constant background vigilance, and others will have little or no effect at all. We don't really yet fully know why this is the case, but what we believe the reasons might be, or kind of lying in how people use their resources, their inner abilities, their inner strengths to deal with events. So much like I invited you earlier in this presentation to connect with the felt sense in your body of what some of the things that you've felt successful about over the last few months, some of the things that you've dealt with and overcome. It's those kinds of what we call somatic resources, those kinds of felt sense of successes and resources that some people seem to use in order to deal with trauma. And interestingly, as we come on to the next stage of this and look at the ways to work with trauma, those same positive felt senses are also a big part of how we can help people to heal up those trauma and re-regulate the parts of the nervous system that have gone into that hypervigilance. So there's some interesting things just to wrap this part up about the amygdala, this part of the brain that goes into hypervigilance, that when it becomes overwhelmed. And so any time a person thinks about an event that first created a trauma, it'll trigger that anxiety and that fear potentially in that person again. And this is one of the reasons why some traditional talking type therapies are less helpful with trauma, because in a situation where we're inviting the person to reconnect with and re-talk about that trauma, it can be actually re-traumatizing for them. So this emergence of, in the last few years, of this somatic approach to working with trauma has been a revelation in not requiring people to revisit the trauma, but only to revisit the felt sense of that. So in other words, they can stay to a degree at a distance from that in the process. Trauma generalizes over time. So anything that your brain can group with the original trauma becomes something that can also be extended and reacted to. So for example, a child witnessing what I talked about above, a loved one going into experiencing a situation where a loved one was injured or taken into hospital, that child might generalize later any situation where leaving home occurs because that relative went away to the hospital. Any situation where that happens, it might generalize that as a trigger for trauma. So actually then for that child, even going to school may trigger a trauma response because of the generalization. And this next bit is also really interesting about trauma, is that normally when an event happens, we have an experience, you go to the shops, you meet a friend, you'll have some sort of date stamping going on in the hippocampus in the brain. So, and if there's an event with any sort of anxiety around it, if that anxiety trips us up into that high state of arousal that we call trauma, what will happen is the parts of the brain that lay down memory don't get activated in the same way. So instead of you having a specific time event memory and an emotional memory of that, what happens is that anxiety from that event tends to move with us because it doesn't have a place where it's locked down in time. So that's a very interesting aspect to it. And it's one of the reasons why this is another way of recognizing trauma. When people say they find it hard to explain why they've got the feeling or what the feeling is, what we call in trauma-informed work, inarticulability, if it's difficult to articulate what this feeling is and where it comes from, that's often a sign of that floating anxiety that's come from this sort of hyper-arousal kind of state. So, how can we work with trauma? So, we know now that trauma comes from overwhelm. It comes from a state where a person doesn't feel they've got the resources to support and cope with a circumstance or set of circumstances that have happened. But what is it that we can actually do? Well, it's interesting that pretty much everything that we do in our homes, in our classrooms, in our workplaces, to create a supportive, positive environment for working or learning is actually also perfect for the support of people with trauma and trauma recovery. So if we think about schools, for those small number of pupils who were affected by trauma in a big way, and that might interfere with their learning and their well-being at school, the way out of trauma for them is to have two things present. One, for them to feel safe in that environment, and two, for them to be in touch with their own resources. In other words, to feel a high sense of self-esteem. And that, in a nutshell, is what we need to remember above all else when we're working with people in trauma. If the person can feel safe and have a positive connection with their self-esteem, their amygdala, that part of the brain, will downcycle. And it may even do so, well, it may do so in that moment, but may even do so permanently. Because if the trauma trigger was fired and yet the brain realizes that they feel safe in that situation, their nervous system will correct itself. That's what we know from lots of research now on different ways of dealing with trauma. They all seem to have these factors in them. Helping the person to feel safe, helping them to feel esteemed, at the same time as they have some connection with the trauma felt sense. So if they're in touch with their personal resources, their esteem, they'll start to self-correct. If someone seems stuck and they're showing sort of unmanageable levels of either raw or adapted trauma behaviour, it's the safety and the self-esteem that they most need. So the calm voice, the calm interventions, the clear, simple instructions, coaching more than telling, giving space for them to calm down, having recognizing that a person who carries a lot of trauma has triggered, and what will often happen as well is that they'll be super tired afterwards. So being alert and aware to that as well. So some of that's, it's hard to hear that stuff, and in my work I hear it every day. But I'm so energized by the progress that can be made with really 5 simple principles. So as we come towards the end of the session today, I just want to share some core principles that can really help around working with trauma, and then look at some more specific things that can be done. One tool I'm going to make available to you today, which is particularly useful for managing, helping people to manage their anxiety, and then 3 different approaches that you might be interested in finding out more about. So first of all, these 5 principles for working with trauma. So principle number 1, trauma, the root of trauma is often hidden. So you might not understand why a person is triggered, but when you see those sorts of behaviors that we've talked about, or you've seen the physiological signs that somebody's anxious, remember that because trauma generalizes over time, some of the behaviors that you see in the list that I mentioned earlier might be present, but the reason for the trauma might not be evident to you. There may have been a whole sequence of events that morning, that day, that afternoon, or even in the days leading up to that. There may be an anniversary that you're not aware of. So being aware of the signs that trauma might be triggering, in a sense, is all that you need to do. It's often not helpful to try and work out precisely what is it that created that trigger at that moment. So, for example, might be that the word relax might have been used by a controlling person at some point in this person who's triggered experience. And if that's used by a colleague or a friend in jest, it might be the trigger that sends that person into a moment of overwhelm again. So kind of main point there is work with your awareness rather than necessarily trying to figure out precisely what that trigger is. The trauma triggers are like family trees. There are many, many components. It's a bit like the family tree diagram. Principle number 2, trauma triggering can be prevented. So when people feel in an environment, whether it's on a one-to-one or in a group, where they feel safe, positive, it's hopeful and supportive, and they've got the right level of challenge and support, then trauma finds it very difficult to trigger. So as a teacher, as a parent, as a key worker, continuing to do all the things that you do to create that happy, healthy, esteeming environment is exactly the right thing for children and for adults with trauma. Number 3, trauma triggering is inflamed by other people's behaviours. So being aware of your own pieces of trauma, which sometimes when you see it in others can trigger you. Adults experience trauma too, but you're less likely to see these raw trauma responses in adults than the panic, the anxiety, the fear, although you may do. But here's something really important about the inflaming of trauma triggers. Anything around shaming, sarcasm, shouting, threatening or aggressive responses will escalate these involuntary behaviours that come out of a traumatized individual. And using all of these principles that we've been talking about to help the calmness and resolve that is going to help. Inflaming an already triggered child just also adds evidence to the nervous system of the lack of safety and can exacerbate generalization. And I think it's really important to realize here that in an appropriate and proper way, it's okay and important to challenge behaviors around you that you see that might be
Hello.
So number 4, trauma can be downgraded. 4 and 5 are just fill me with hope, and I see the examples of this every day. This happens naturally when the body, the sooner the person feels safe. So anything you can do to make that person feel safe in that situation, give them space, give them the chance to withdraw, reassure them, offer alternative options, the sooner you'll manage down the effect and minimize the effects of that, if it's a learning environment, on their learning. So avoid anything that might be interpreted as embarrassing or shaming for the individual or the group there, because those things are just rocket fuel to trauma. And in that way, you're working to create an environment where this very primitive, what we sometimes call the lizard part of the brain, calms itself. 5th one, trauma can be healed. So by a combination of raising a person's self-esteem, helping them to connect with what they do well, what their resources are, and helping the person to use their natural resources to deal with situations. So giving them space, letting them calm down, but reinforce all of the positives of that person, inviting them to remember what they've done well recently, invite them to bring the feelings of doing well to the feelings of this overwhelm. These are all very helpful approaches to help an individual to actually heal the trauma. Because what we know now from research, fantastic research in a book I'll recommend at the end of this session, is that when you bring a person's resources in a safe environment to the felt sense of a trauma trigger, it starts to heal. Now I'm presenting that in a very simplistic way. There are some very useful techniques that make that happen as effectively and safely as possible. But those are the essential elements: self-esteem, safe environment, at a point when a person is in touch to a degree with those triggers. So just to finish up then, there are three areas I think that if you're interested in working with trauma triggers going forward, working with people to support them, there are three different approaches that have come out of this idea of what we call somatic psychotherapy or somatic coaching, where we are creating a safe environment and we are raising a person's connection and awareness with their strengths and resources, helping them to grow new ones, because sometimes a person doesn't have all the resources that they could have, so helping them to learn new resources too, and then bringing those in a safe way by a process we call titrating and pendulating. So we do it in a very gradual and safe way. We help the person to resolve that trauma and to do so permanently. So there's three areas to be, I think, to be looking into here. One is this somatic trauma-informed coaching approach, and Julia Vaughan-Smith has written a brilliant book on that called Coaching in Trauma, From Surviving to Thriving. The other is emotional freedom technique, and over the last 7 years or so, I wish I'd learned EFT, both as for myself and also for the client groups that I work with years ago, because it's an utterly miraculous and empowering tool. And for those of you that haven't come across it before, it sounds a very strange thing. EFT involves you tapping specific points around the hands, face and body, and the process of tapping and using some language that helps to create safety and positive affirmation downcycles the amygdala. There's a fascinating body of research now, and if you want to look into it, the Emotional Freedom Technique International's website is superb for giving you all of the academic research and clinical trials on that. And then the last area is, it's been around a long time, but is gaining traction, gaining traction in recent years, is something called Satir transformational practice, which relates to the image I've got on the right of the screen there. And this uses Virginia Satir's iceberg model, and also elements of this somatic approach to bringing resources to difficulties and challenges, the trauma type response. So those are three areas I'd encourage you to look into. I can't go into any more detail in the time we've got today. What I can give you a very specific resource, I've popped this onto, it's in a blog at willthomascoaching.com/SSF, and that's a tool for grounding a panic attack. And it also works for sort of any situation where you want to reduce levels of anxiety. So there's a tool you can go and take a look at with full instructions there too. If you are interested in learning more about those three areas I've just described, I'm running the next trauma-informed coaching program starting on the 15th of October. So it gives you a much deeper understanding of trauma, even deeper than we've looked at today. Lots of how-to. It's evidence-based, and it looks at the somatic trauma-informed coaching, how to use EFT and teach it to others, because it's a super empowering tool to give others. Satir transformational coaching as well, and how to use that. And then lots of recorded client sessions where you can see how these can be used individually, but also how they can be combined, because these work beautifully together. So if you're looking for a bit more kind of CPD, and through these long winter nights that are going to emerge in the next few months, it's a 9-hour program. So it's not a huge length of program, but it's it gives you exercises and activities to go away and try and reflect on. And there's it's a very flexible program. So you'd be having there's a self-study version, and there's one with support from a tutor. If you are interested in that, details are also at willthomascoaching.com/SSF. And I've popped in a discount for SSF supporters for the next 24 hours, and we'll also be donating an amount from the from anyone that signs up for that course to SSF. So it's a great all-round there. So I'm conscious of time and allowing time for questions. So just to wrap up then, I think here are some main takeaways, and I'm sure there'll be other things that you wanted to draw from today. But I think the first one is going back to the Kubler-Ross cycle. It's so important for us in this extraordinary amount of change that we've been going through over these last few months to just really be patient and to recognize that everyone is in a different stage of that change cycle. And this change cycle is ongoing, it's multi-layered. So things can happen in our lives that then cause us to trip into earlier stages of that model that I put up there, and sometimes to accelerate us to later stages as well. The trauma shows up in these raw and adaptive ways. So be aware that sometimes it's there are signs and symptoms on the outside of a person in terms of their physiology, their breathing, their coloration, and so forth. But very often you get these adaptive behaviours, the rescuing, the people pleasing, the blaming and criticising. Trauma's an automatic survival response. This is a really difficult one to kind of get our heads around. I think that when a person is in raw triggering, they can't help it. That is their brain taking over at a deeply unconscious level. So it's remembering that in the dealing with this kind of experience. Trauma responses are downgraded and healed by making people feel safe and helping them to get connected to their strengths and resources, helping to raise their self-esteem. High levels of trauma response might be a sign of a need for signposting. So if you're seeing that a lot, as I explained at the beginning of this, unless you are a psychotherapist, then it may well be the case that within your organisation or within the way that you work, there'll be a need for using the various signposting to other support. So it's okay to ask for that support, but it's also in the context of those broad practices of safety and self-esteem important to you can make a difference by doing that. And finally, you can learn these simple and effective approaches to working with people. That is absolutely something that you can kind of learn and develop through the approaches that we've been talking about today. So and I think that's so hopeful in the context of probably a lot more trauma that's around from the early research that's been done around the pandemic. So other resources, places to go. We've made a recording of this, so Anne will let you know how to access that. The grounding and panic attack resources at that web address that I read out earlier, willthomascoaching.com/SSF. You can read the article. I wrote a longer article on the change cycle and its relationship to coronavirus a few months ago. That's also available on my website. Drop me an email. I'd love to hear from you if you have any questions. If you want to find out more about the online program, the address is there. And there's the book that I recommend, The Coaching and Trauma from Surviving to Thriving book, which is a really excellent, it's very well referenced at the same time as being very readable. So it's a great book there to also consider. There is an activity there which I'll just leave up on the screen. You might want to look at that later on. So thank you all so much for coming along, staying along, and I wish you all very best of luck in whatever you're doing with this work with trauma in your world, in your lives, and in your work. And yeah, do come back to me if you've any questions. I'm going to hand back over to Anne.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I know we've run over by a couple of minutes, but myself and Will are very happy to take some questions. People have put a couple of questions in the chat already, Will.
Okay.
So the first one that we've got is, when dealing with a trauma sufferer, bonding over, sorry, let me read it again. When dealing with a trauma sufferer, how do you avoid bonding over trauma that you yourself may have experienced?
Yeah, really good question. One of the really important things about working with people who've experienced trauma is to be really aware of your own trauma. And so I would always recommend, if you are working with people who have trauma and you've got some pieces that you think are potentially triggering for you, that you seek out some supervision. And I mean, I work with it all the time, and it does, things that people say do trigger you, but the key to working with this is to continue your own journey of working with your trauma as well. So that's where I think supervision is really important. I think the other thing is to be very aware when you are. Oh.
Somebody's not unmuted. I don't know who it was.
I don't know. Sorry. Yeah. So I think the other thing is, it's how you ground yourself. So in a session, in a conversation with somebody whose trauma experiences are also triggering you, it's important to have your own tools developed for grounding yourself and staying out of the triggers that you have. The less you the more you can manage your own triggering in a conversation, the less you're likely to move into the placating kind of response, which is where that bonding potentially can come in. So yeah, and it happens, it does happen, but it's something that it's about the way that we manage ourselves in that too.
Thank you, Will. And the other question that we had was, how much is the 9-hour program?
Oh yeah, I did put that in, did I? I'm never very good with figures. I think no, hang on a sec. So the self-study is £159 and the supported study is £329. So it's normally 199 and 399. So there's yes, there's about a third, I think, off each of those. My math is correct.
Thank you, Will. And Amber has a question. Amber, would you like to ask the question?
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can, Amber. I can't see you though.
Yeah, no, no, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. You don't need to see.
I just wanted to know, you said at one point that trauma generalizes or something. If you could just elaborate on that, like what active symptoms or signs show that trauma is, in your words, generalizing?
Yeah, so this is something that as we work with someone who's experienced trauma, there's two kinds of ways in which trauma generalizes. The one relates to that idea of the non-date stamping of an experience. So you can get generalization in terms of you have this floating anxiety that just kind of lives with you, and you might be experiencing it every day, and it might be at a low level all the time. So that's one way in which it can generalize. The other way in which it generalizes, to give you an example, so a client I worked with a few years back, she had an experience where she was taking her dog for a walk, and her and a dog were attacked by another dog, and her dog was badly injured, and she was injured as well, although it's not severely, but she was injured in the incident, trying to prevent this dog from attacking. This dog happened to be a Rottweiler, and so for several years afterwards, anytime she saw a Rottweiler, she became very anxious and wanted to avoid the situation and get out of it. But around about 7 or 8 years after, she started to notice that pretty much any kind of dog that she met on a walk with her dog would create that trigger and that same kind of anxiety and hypervigilance. Came to me at the point where about another 4 or 5 years later, she was actually afraid to go out at all. So she wouldn't take a dog out, but it was started to make her afraid to come out of the house in any way, shape or form. So that's an example of how you get this kind of mission creep with trauma. It starts off being quite specific for some people, and then it can gradually become more and more generalized. So it actually becomes something that turns into a more of agoraphobic symptoms. Some people can track it back through their experience and as they deal with the trauma, and they can see that pathway. And there is another technique we haven't talked about today called timeline therapy, which is a kind of a dissociated and safe way of going back along your timeline to explore and understand the past. It's a Gestalt kind of approach to, if you get the positive learning from an experience in the past that was negative, the unconscious has no further need to hold on to those negative emotions, and so it lets them go. And in that kind of process, often people can see, this happened and then this became more generalized and it became this and then it became this. So that example I've just given you was one that was actually, she could track that, but often people can't. So it's often something you get a sense of as the therapist, but you don't always get it's not always a concrete, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Is there one final question, or are you happy to wrap up and ask questions by email?
I have one final question. Sorry. It's so interesting. Sorry.
It's okay.
Go ahead.
So obviously there's a clinical aspect to trauma where, I'm not a specialist, but from what I'm understanding is that there's a chemical process that goes on in the brain with the brain picture you showed us. But in terms of more holistic treatment, like arts therapy, are there any specific kind of like methods that you can use in a more holistic way to combat the consequences of PTSD if it's already emerged in a person?
Sure. Yeah. Now, the basic principle that I've talked about today, this idea of a person being aware of their their trauma, anxiety stuff in that felt sense way. So in the way that I described at the beginning of the session today, when I invited you to go and get in touch with the positive experiences you've had and that felt sense, that where you feel that in your body. In an art therapy context, we can also invite people to get in touch with those kinds of resources. And in fact, we can use creative media to as a vehicle for getting in touch with all their strengths and resources. If we're working with a person who has got a particular area of anxiety, by using that same principle of, in an art therapy kind of session, you're creating a safe space, so there's no judgment, there's no put downs, it's confidential, etc., etc. Adding in there, enabling them to use whatever art media in a loose and a loose, unjudged, unstructured kind of way. You're creating the opportunity for them to access their resources and their abilities and their skills. They're going to feel good in that environment. If in art therapy context, you're then able to bring in elements of their anxiety and then invite them to use art and creative media to bring the two together. In other words, bring the resources and the angst making felt sense together through the artwork. Potentially, you could have the same healing effects. I don't know what the research is on that, but I do have somebody on a call, one of my courses at the moment, who is an art therapist, and she's become very excited by the ways in which using creative media to bring out a person's creativity and resources. And let's face it, creativity is a huge resource in its own right.
Yeah.
And bringing that across to the difficulties and the challenges that person has is having a healing effect with clients.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Will, for taking the time. And it's a huge topic, but I think you've given us all some food for thought for the future. And I will follow up with a very short survey to everybody, just so that we can improve our teaching and learning. I'm going to put the link into the chat now in case people want to do it before you leave. But if not, I will follow up by email as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you all for coming along. And,
yeah, thank you. And I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Remember.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.